the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's talk. And I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Welcome to my listeners in the United States and around the world. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com. The Spirit of St. Louis, the flight of Apollo 8, Charles Lindbergh, NASA, astronauts, the best, the brightest, heroes of American aviation. Heroes, and couldn't we use just a few of those right about now? We take a look at the right stuff, the early heroes of the space race, and Charles Lindbergh's daring and immortal 1927 Transatlantic Crossing with science editor and senior writer for Time magazine, Jeffrey Kluger, author of Apollo 8, the thrilling story of the first mission to the moon, and with decorated flyboy and author of The Flight, Dan Hampton. Today, on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, we have a lot to talk about. Let's get to it. This month marks the 90th anniversary of the first solo transatlantic flight and the first non-stop flight between North America and mainland Europe of legendary aviator Charles Lindbergh. Who better to write the story of Charles Lindbergh's 1927 Transatlantic Crossing than acclaimed aviator and aviation historian Dan Hampton, the New York Times bestselling author of Viper Pilot, Lords of the Sky, and The Hunter Killers. During his 20 years of service in the United States Air Force, Colonel Hampton received 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses with Valor, a Purple Heart, and numerous other decorations. Dan is a graduate of the United States Air Force Fighter Weapons School, United States Navy Top Gun School, and United States Air Force Special Operations School. Placing himself squarely in the cockpit with Lindbergh, Hampton's book offers a flyboy's perspective to bring alive the danger, uncertainty, and heroic accomplishment of Lindbergh's death-defying, non-stop flight across the Atlantic in the spirit of St. Louis, an achievement that brought the world to a halt in May 1927 and made Lucky Lindy, also nicknamed Slim, the most celebrated man of his time and the most controversial. Let's talk. So, you picked a heck of a story, right, this time around, particularly as this time in American history when Lindbergh is again in the hot seat as terms like America first re-enter the American zeitgeist. But I want to get politics out of the way, as do you in this terrific book. So let's do that. Okay? Let's just...
Fair enough.
Deal with it, and then it's gone. Dan,
right.
Your first line in the author's note reads, Charles Augustus Lindbergh was a complicated man in later years, certainly a controversial one. Now, long way around, I've known my share fair of pilots, right? And taking all of that politics out of who he is, he's a complicated man. You're a complicated man. Is that something that goes along with being a pilot?
No, I'm very simple. Let's see, food, a martini, enough sleep.
Do you know what I'm saying?
You know, I think most people, regardless of their profession, are complicated to some degree. There's always more to most people than meets the eye. Some of them are, in fact, the simple tools that they appear to be, but Lindbergh definitely was not. And I put that line in there because I didn't want people to think that I was, enamored of this guy to the point where I didn't know his weaknesses, and I do. I realize, he's a man, he's a human, he made a lot of mistakes. Some of what he did was controversial, some of it's pure myth, which we can talk about if you want, but regardless of all of that, nobody can take away the fact that this 25-year-old guy did something that everybody thought was impossible to do, and he did it by himself.
And I do think that's important, and that's where I want to stay. We could have another conversation about him in a political forum, but I don't think it belongs to this part of the story because I think, like you said, you can't take away his achievement. It's clear that you have enormous respect for him. I mean, that's obvious from reading the book. From a pilot's perspective, share with us what you think you flyboys have in your temperament that someone like you would even think to pilot a powerful machine like an F-16 or Lindbergh a plane like the Spirit of St. Louis. Dan, do you have something in your blood different than mine? I'm not going there.
I think the best way to answer that would be to say there's something in me that would never believe I couldn't do it. How about that? And it gets mistaken a lot, both in his day and my day and every time in between. Basically, since one person could take a plane off and someone couldn't, it gets mistaken as arrogance and cockiness, and maybe there's some of that there, but really what it is and what Lindbergh had was confidence. He knew he could fly well, and he believed in what he could do. And without that, he wouldn't have gone near the Spirit of St. Louis. I would never have gone near an F-16 or an F-22 if I didn't believe I could do it. That is not the time for self-doubt. Now, that doesn't mean you're a cocky, reckless fool, but it just means you have to believe in yourself and what you can do, or you're not going to survive. And certainly that's what he believed about himself.
A man in his plane. What is that? When Lindbergh got into the Spirit of St. Louis and began that flight across the Atlantic, when you entered some of the flight jets that you commandeered, there has to be a relationship between man and machine, and woman and machine, depending on who the pilot is. Talk to me about that. Is trust involved, mastery of man over machine, honing one's skill, delusion, a gambler's mentality?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about all these things. Which one, or do all the above? What?
Right. It's really a mix of all the above, and the link between what you fly and yourself. I don't want to get too mystical on you, but I mean it's there. I felt it with the planes that I flew. Yeah, I mean I was the one flying it, but the plane was part of it too. And it's hard to describe to people who don't fly. People who live on boats feel the same way about their boats. It's not alive, but in a way it is. And I know Lindbergh felt part of the Spirit of St. Louis the way I felt like I was part of all the planes that I flew. Because when it comes down to it, he and his plane, or me and mine, are working together against the elements, against nature, against other men in some cases. But we're doing something we're not designed to do. I mean, the plane couldn't fly without a pilot, and the pilot certainly couldn't fly without a plane. It's not something humans are supposed to do. So between us, we are basically flaunting nature in the face, right? We're saying we can do this despite what you do. Do your worst. And so, a bond develops. He was very attached, to his airplane. When he landed in Paris and the people started ripping pieces of it off for souvenirs, he was very upset about it. He was very worried about it, more so than getting sleep and getting a meal and all the other things he wanted to do. He had to make sure his plane was safe. So yeah, it's there.
Can I ask you about fear? Is fear even allowed, or is fear something that maybe in the back of your mind might be there if you're a Lindbergh and you're going on this daunting task? Or is it just you don't even let it get to the surface? It's just forget about it. Fear just isn't in the lexicon. What's the deal with fear?
Well, it's there. What you do is you learn to put it in its place and you learn to live with it. Nobody flies. I'm not talking about riding in an airplane, but flying. Nobody flies an airplane or gets blasted into outer space or goes down to the bottom of the ocean without considering some of that. But again, if you let it rule you, you're not going to get very far. So the trick is, to the extent you can, you're trained for it. And then to the extent you can be familiar with it and learn to live with it, then you do. Because you have to, or you won't be able to function. Fear is useful, as long as it's kept in its place. And for Lindbergh especially, and when he ran into that 1,000-mile storm at night in that little airplane over the North Atlantic, I guarantee you he was apprehensive. I don't think he was fearful. I think he was a bit apprehensive, but he was able to master it and control it and continue on. Otherwise, he'd have flown into the ocean and I'd be writing about somebody else.
Where does it sit? Does it sit in your gut? Does it sit in your brain? Where does fear hang out for a guy like you, for a guy like Lindy?
Well, for me, it's in your head mostly, because you're a thinking human being. You have to consider it. It's there. When it comes up through your gut, something has happened. In Lindbergh's case, it's the first time he hits really bad turbulence and the plane drops out from underneath him. His head bangs on the top and he thinks, what in the world was that? Did I lose a wing? Or when he goes to sleep and he wakes up, and he's disoriented, pointing at the ocean. I guarantee you the fear came up through his gut, at that point in time. But again, you master it. You don't let it rule you. You certainly don't let it overcome you. And you recover and you go on. And that's what he did.
Okay, question about this guy. A big misnomer here is, he had such a good-looking man, fabulous-looking guy. People, and very elegant in a way, and people always think that
you should have seen his father.
Yeah, his dad was cute too, huh? But people think that he came from wealth. He didn't come from wealth. He didn't come from abject poverty. But what in his background made him right to become the hero he became?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I did touch a little bit on that in the book because it describes who he was, right? And there was a time when his father was what would have been called wealthy then. He was a prominent lawyer, and then he became a congressman. But he got into some bad investments and ended up losing it all. So, Lindbergh did not, as is, like you said, popularly portrayed, he didn't grow up poor. But, he didn't grow up fabulously wealthy. Although he did go to a private school in Washington, D.C. with a couple of the Roosevelt kids. And, he hunted Easter eggs on the White House lawn and some other things. But in his heart, he was always, like his father, like his grandfather, he was always a loner. Some of that, I think, is hereditary. They were Scandinavian. Some of that is the product of his environment. He was between Washington trips. He was raised in Minnesota, for the most part, and he loved being outside. He loved being out with his dog and a gun, and he loved to go fishing and camping. He was a loner, and that served him well. To be honest, it serves guys who fly single-seat airplanes pretty well because you don't end up depending on anybody but yourself. And from his earliest days, he was always sort of thrust into situations alone that he had to deal with, and that served him well when he crossed the Atlantic.
I have to tell you, you and I share some friends, pilots. I've never met a pilot who wasn't a loner at heart, including you.
Well, a fighter pilot anyway. And I'm not digging on the other kinds of pilots. It's just a different mentality, and that's why I think people gravitate to certain types of flying, because that's what you're cut out to do. That's what you're adapted to do. In my case, in Lindbergh's case, it was, single seat kind of mentality. You're alone, and you can handle it. Other people are more comfortable in other forms of flight.
Now, listen, I know you did a heck of a lot of research for this book, and that's terrific. But the best research is the fact that you yourself are a fighter pilot, and you've flown across the ocean by yourself, the Atlantic. So talk to me how that changes one's perspective, or how that actually helps your perspective in understanding what Lindy went through on that unbelievable flight of his.
Well, to clarify, I flew across alone in my airplane. I flew across in the company of other planes, so I was never completely alone out there.
Yeah.
However, if something had ever happened, yes, in fact, I am instantly, irrevocably alone.
I would say.
And when you know that, you realize all that could go wrong, and there's a lot that could go wrong then and now. You tend to look at things a little bit differently, and I was able to incorporate that in this book because I know what it feels like when the sun's going down behind you and all that's in front of you is nothing, blackness, except for, oh my God, I can see lightning out there 100 miles, 1,000 miles, who knows, big, huge wall of thunderstorms, and I got to fly through it. I know the relief you feel when you break out of the clouds after flying in them for 10 hours and you see the sun or the moon. You're like, I can breathe again, or your first sight of land after being over the water, for all those hours, and you think, there's the coast. If something happens to me now, at least I won't go down in the ocean. And he thought all those same things, and I'd seen Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Ireland and the coast of France and everything else from the air, just like he did. So, when he's talking about it, it's not just words to me. It's pictures. And I think I was able to put those pictures down on paper to the extent where, somebody reading it would feel like they were there, which was the point.
So I'm gonna take you someplace. I don't know anybody else has ever asked you this, but I'm gonna go there. At the core of every pilot, is there also the heart of a poet? I mean, how can anyone who flies, and flying an aircraft is a whole lot different than being a passenger, as I know, having flown. You're alone soaring in the sky with the most uncanny vistas and ever-changing skyscape. I mean, you gotta be a poet too, no?
I think you're right. I don't know of too many pilots that would admit it, especially fighter pilots. I'll answer that in a roundabout way by saying I've always loved poetry. I can't write it, but I appreciate it. And a lot of fine poetry has come out, in their later years from guys that have done things similar to this. And, like Lindbergh was complicated, and like you talked about in the beginning, I think to some degree maybe we are a bit more complicated or confusing, depending on who you are. There were guys in my fighter squadrons that, one of them had been an eye doctor before he was a pilot. Another one was a concert pianist. Another guy had put himself through college as a stripper. So, there are all kinds of very complicated, interesting individuals. How much they reveal, though, well, that's problematic. And that was one of Lindbergh's problems. maybe not problems, but he didn't reveal a lot about himself, and he didn't see the need to explain his actions to people. And I think later on in life, that's one of the things that might have hurt him a bit.
The mystery, people. There was a wall between him and the public, and he kept it there throughout his life. Right. And that does get people suspicious. It's the ones who can open up their souls that seem to do better in that public arena. Was he a fan? Were you a fan of his as a kid? Was he a boyhood hero, or this was something you took on later in life? I don't even know with you. Did you start flying young? I don't even know that. As long as I've known you, I don't know.
What?
Did you start flying when you were young? I don't even know whether that happened when you were...
Yeah, I started flying when I was a teenager. I thought it was a good way to meet girls.
Okay, never knew that.
Turned out to be a massive miscalculation on my part.
I don't believe you.
But my dad and my grandfather were both pilots, fighter pilots. So it sort of, I guess, is in the blood. I think in a weird kind of adolescent, obtuse way, he was a hero just because I knew sort of what was involved in what he did, and I thought, well, that's really cool. The same way you would idolize an Alan Shepard or a John Glenn, or a Neil Armstrong, somebody that does something that nobody else had ever done before. And that's really what made him what he was. And I went to some pains in the book to describe the 1920s so that people would understand why he was such a huge sensation, after this happened. And I hope some of that came through.
Very much so, and very important, because the 20s was unique to history. So much groundbreaking, so much change, so much opening up of things that, other than the 60s, I don't really know another time that was quite like it. Interesting to me, two-pronged question. Why did Lindbergh want to take this on? I mean, of all we've discussed thus far, what was his primary motivation for making this flight? And was he doing this for himself, for aviation, someone else, something? Talk to me.
I think he was doing it for himself from the standpoint that people told him he couldn't do it. He was not a self-promoter. Richard Byrd was a gentleman, a very, well-spoken, articulate man. He went to the North Pole. He was one of Lindbergh's competitors for this. But Richard Byrd was also very keenly aware of publicity, and that was his biggest motivation for doing this. Lindbergh was doing it for himself because people told him that it was impossible for him to do it. And he was doing it for aviation because he truly believed in the potential of flight, and he could see a day when the world was connected by aircraft. And he thought the Orteig Prize was an excellent way to demonstrate that it was possible. And he did. So that's I think those were his biggest motivations.
This thing about aviation, because, it's so much a part of who and what we are these days, but in those days, right? The baby beginnings of it all. I mean, he's such an extraordinary character to me because he is so forward thinking. He's everything that most women would ever want to meet, and yet at the end, not so much. But because he's so bigger than life, and he doesn't even realize it. That's what's so weird about him. Can you think about that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, he was never comfortable with the fame aspect of all this, and I don't think he ever saw himself that way. He never minimized what he did because he was well aware of how difficult it was because he did it, But he didn't think of himself that way, and I think in his own life, for him to go from flying, the Spirit of St. Louis in 1927 to sitting around, a table in Washington, D.C. with the Apollo astronauts, living to see jet aircraft and breaking of the sound barrier and the first man on the moon and all that, it just must have been phenomenal for him, to get to do that. His heroes growing up were the World War I fighter pilots. They were a lot of people's heroes, but himself in particular. And one interesting side note, I don't mean to get off too much, but Jimmy Stewart, the actor, he idolized Charles Lindbergh. He was 19 when Lindbergh took off, and he had a little map board that he'd made up of Lindbergh's flight, and every time they got an update, he'd run upstairs and he'd move the tack, a little bit further along. And then, Jimmy Stewart, aside from being a wonderful actor, was a pilot himself and was one of the very few Hollywood people who actually went off and fought in World War II. They didn't just make movies about it, but he physically fought in World War II. And he got to make that wonderful movie about Charles Lindbergh in the 1950s, The Spirit of St. Louis. And so, the impact of inspiration, of heroes, if you will, I think can't be understated. And there's one reason why I really wanted to do this book, like I mentioned. I wanted people to realize that there are still folks you can believe in.
What was he thinking when he took off? He kept a log, but they were lost, right?
He was thinking, thank God I made it over the trees.
I'd be thinking that too, baby, and genuflecting.
He was. I mean, he didn't clip them like they did in the movie, but he was heavier than he'd thought. He was on a wet, muddy runway. And when we say runway, we think of JFK, right?
Right.
or Dallas Fort Worth. Runway to them was like a golf cart path, or maybe even just a field. That was an airfield. That's why they call that an airfield. It wasn't a runway. And, it was wet, soggy, the testing he had done had all been on the West Coast, so the air was a lot different than the heavy sea air on the East Coast. He was happy just to get off the ground. And then, he'd never flown over water before. So his first trip over water was between Long Island Sound, over Long Island Sound to Connecticut, So he's thinking about all these things as he goes because he'd never done them before.
Just think about that, and just think how crazy that is. That's just, you can't even grasp that. I can't grasp that in my head. There comes a time when you're out there and you reach the point of no return. What's that feel like?
Well, for him, it was halfway across the Atlantic at night, and he was actually sort of relieved when he's doing this all by time because he can't see anything. And he realizes he's 18 hours into the flight, which was actually more than halfway, but he didn't realize that he was getting pushed across the ocean 100 miles an hour faster by the tailwinds. So when he reaches 18 hours or so, he thinks, I'm halfway across. And he makes the mental leap from turning around and going back to Newfoundland to no matter what happens, I'm continuing to Europe because that's the shortest direction to safety. He reached the physical point of no return long before that. As soon as he was outside of gliding distance from land when he left Newfoundland, he was past the point of no return. Because if he'd gone down, nobody would have known it. There were no boats out there. He's well north of the shipping lanes. He has no radio. He's got some flares, but who's going to see him? So pretty much his whole trip was past the point of no return.
Yeah, really fascinating. I hadn't thought about that. What was the most harrowing aspect of the flight?
I think for him, it was, first of all, was navigation, after staying awake, figuring out where he was, because he shows up on the Irish coast 3 hours earlier than he thinks, and so he's not sure where he is, because in his mind, he's still 300 miles out in the ocean, so what is this? So he figures that out, and that gives him an instant second wind. He realizes, not only have I crossed the ocean, but I've made it to Europe, and I know where I am. Those are three good things for a pilot. Anyway, I think the biggest challenge, though, was landing at Le Bourget. He'd never landed the Spirit of St. Louis at night before, much less at Le Bourget, because obviously he'd never been there. So he's landing in an unfamiliar airport at night in a plane he's never landed at night before. And nobody back in New York could tell him anything about Le Bourget. There were no airport charts then like there are now. We have flight information handbooks and everything on every airport in the world. There was none of that. He only had the vaguest idea where it was. Somebody back in Long Island had told him, well, it's kind of north of the Eiffel Tower, maybe 5 or 10 miles. So that's what he did. He flew to Paris, he flew around the Eiffel Tower, and then he headed off towards the biggest, darkest spot he could see, to the north, and figured that had to be Le Bourget.
Right.
So, now he's trying to land this thing after 33 hours in the cockpit. He's exhausted. It's all catching up with him. This is not a runway like we think of it with flashing lights and beacons and towers and everything. It's a field. It's an airfield with a couple of spotlights in one corner, waving around up in his face. That's what there's a picture in the book of him landing at Le Bourget. And that's a really good picture because, it shows him coming in out of the darkness, crossing a brief period of waving spotlights and landing into the darkness. And that's what he had to do.
In some ways, you can say that Lindy's flight was the first world event to go viral. When he started off, there were, 500 who came to the airfield to see him off. And when he lands in Paris, whoa, my God, 30 hours later, 100,000? I mean, mobbed his plane.
Screaming, hysterical Frenchmen.
Right? Can you imagine? Was he prepared for that? I can't imagine that anybody
Not even
would've...
close.
Yeah, right.
Not even close. He had no idea. He didn't even know. He didn't know that they were headlights jammed on the roads. He thought it was just a traffic jam. He had no idea what all the lights were. He figured out they were headlights, and then he figured, well, what are they? They must be stuck or something. He had no clue, and it didn't really dawn on him until he landed and shut the engine off, and turned the plane around and shut the engine off, and saw this mob of surging, massive people running across the field towards him. He couldn't get his arms around. And this is a kid that was worried about not having a French visa in his passport, okay, or a spare toothbrush. That's what he was worried about. He had no clue of what was about to happen to him.
Listen to me. It's 1927. He's 25 years old. He'd never flown, as you said, over open water. And the Spirit of St. Louis was a single-engine experiment, right? That's really all that it was. Yeah. It's a 3,600-mile journey that laid before him. News of the flight had circled the globe. I mean, ticker tape parades. I mean, come on. He's a national hero. Medal of Honor, by the way, for Times Man of the Year, and he revolutionized aviation. In the thousands and thousands of miles he traveled, Dan, in his life thereafter, and he died, he was 72, I think you say it is. He died of lymphoma. Do you think that he would say...
in Hawaii.
Yeah. Do you think that he would say anything he did from that time forward would measure up to that starting journey?
Well, that's an interesting point of view, and you're one of the only people that's asked it. And, that, I think, is a problem to anybody who gains instant fame, is everybody's expecting, what are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? And to some degree, I think that followed him around. Now, he was a lot more self-contained and confident than, the empty-headed celebrity twits we have now. He knew who he was, he knew who he was. And he never was trying to prove himself to anybody. He was proving things to himself. He wasn't proving what he did to the world. So I don't think he really cared about public opinion. But for himself, for his own edification, I think there were times where he felt like he had to go on. He had to do other things, and that's why I mentioned that in the epilogue. About all the work he did for environmentalism and medical research and some of the other things that he was very interested in.
It was a heroic life. And it was a tragedy. A fascinating book, fascinating man, as are you, my friend
thank
Dan.
You. I appreciate it.
I've been speaking with Dan Hampton, author of The Flight, Charles Lindbergh's Daring and Immortal 1927 Transatlantic Crossing. For more information on the book and on Dan Hampton, visit danhamptonauthor.com. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guest today are flyboy and author of The Flight, Charles Lindbergh's Daring and Immortal 1927 Transatlantic Crossing, Dan Hampton, and science editor and senior writer for Time magazine, Jeffrey Kluger, author of Apollo 8, the thrilling story of the first mission to the moon. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us.
A message from the American Podcast Council.
Hey, everybody, gather around the piano.
Oh, all right. Boy. Hey, what you listening to? Podcasts. How can I listen to podcasts?
Here, let me show you real fast.
It's easier than baking a cake.
Well, I should hope so.
Hey, there's nothing on earth like a genuine, bona fide, electrified 3-part podcast.
Yeah.
That's right. And it seems today, in our troubled world, most people don't know what a podcast is.
No!
It's true, but got one in your ear right now.
Sure do.
So please, help me out. Show your friends and neighbors how to cast a pod.
Okay.
Then tell the world about your favorite show using hashtag tripod. That's TRYPOD with a capital T and that rhymes with P, and you know what that stands for.
Podcast.
Hashtag tripod. That's TRY pod.
The story of Apollo 8 begins in August 1968. NASA was losing the space race with Russia, with earliest estimates of going to the moon still more than 2 years in the future, and President Kennedy's promise to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade was sure to be broken. The United States was deep into the Cold War, and in the middle of a year of violence abroad and at home. from Vietnam through Cambodia, Southeast Asia, was in flames. The Soviet Union had just invaded Prague, crushing a tentative democracy movement. Both Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated, and dozens of cities across the country had been convulsed by race riots during the summer, with the Democratic Convention in Chicago similarly descending into violence. And so it was that in the midst of all of that turmoil, NASA scrapped their meticulous mission schedules and asked 3 brave men to orbit the moon, and they would do it in just 4 months. The risks were substantial. The astronauts were flying a spacecraft that had killed a 3-man crew in a launch pad fire just a year earlier. The rocket was unproven and had failed its most recent test flight, and they were facing an abbreviated training period for the unprecedented journey. But despite the huge risks involved, astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders signed on to the Apollo 8 mission, equal parts fearless and reckless, ingenious and impulsive. A calculated risk and a wild crapshoot, the story told in Apollo 8, the thrilling story of the first mission to the moon, written by Jeffrey Kluger, a science editor and a senior writer for Time for more than 2 decades, and Jim Lovell's co-author on their best-selling book Apollo 13, on which the beloved film is based. Jeffrey Kluger is my guest for the half hour. Let's talk. Listen, this book couldn't come at a better time, I have to tell you. We need heroes. We're desperate for heroes.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. Someone else mentioned that today, and it was the first time I had thought about it that way, and I thought, well, yeah, if Apollo 8 came at a time we needed it, I mean, the mission, maybe the Apollo 8 book will help a little bit, too, in some small way. I hope so. We really do have to remember.
I was going to say, absolutely. Listen, I want to begin with the astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. It's hard to believe these guys are in their 80s. 2 of them are pushing 90.
I know.
What? Where did the time fly, right?
They are. And the thing is, I mean, some of this says something about how brilliantly NASA selected its astronauts. If you pick 15, 20 random 38-year-old men in the 1960s and say, okay, let's flash forward 50 years, how many of them are still going to be around? How many of them are still going to be able to fly their own private planes? You'd say, maybe 2, maybe 1. Well, so many of them have survived this long because NASA selected for calm and for resolve and for even-keeled temperaments and just guys who love to work and love to be alive. And that's what I've found in talking to all of them.
Can I just tell you one thing off topic? Your voice is mesmerizing me. I love your voice. You need to be on radio.
Thank you so much.
What can I tell you?
Well, it's very sweet of you to say that.
I will
tell you a self-humbling story about that. I asked my ear, nose, and throat doctor about 5 years ago. I said, I noticed my voice has gotten a little bit deeper. Do you know why? And I thought she was going to say, well, it's some later life surge of testosterone. And she said, yeah, it's mucus. It's just mucus on your vocal cords. And I said, all right, well, then don't give me an expectorant. Because...
That's funny. Well, if that's what it takes, I need to get some. Listen to me.
Exactly.
Right? When you talk to these guys, I've just got to ask you, I mean, is hero all over their bodies, and do they wear it well? Being in their presence, they are 3 very unique men.
Indeed they are, and of course it's not just these 3 guys. I mean, they were the first human beings to go to another world, so they're pretty extraordinary. But I've met a lot of astronauts, and I've met a lot of lunar astronauts, and I can't think of one who doesn't wear it well. I can't think of one who doesn't carry what they did with a certain amount of grace, with a certain amount of humility, more than a certain amount, really, with a certain amount of appreciation for having been given the opportunity to do what they did. They realize, of course, look, I mean, Lindbergh or the Wright brothers could build their own plane and fly it. Lindbergh needed to be financed, yes, but the Wright brothers didn't need anybody. They just got a little space on the beach, built a plane, and flew it. In order to be among the first people to travel to another world, you have to be selected, you have to be trained, the mission has to be bankrolled, you have to be put in a position to make history. And all of these guys spoke of themselves as nothing more than the tip of the spear. And in the case of a rocket, it was almost literally that, this, pointed thing with 3 people at the top. But beneath them were 400,000 other people who worked in the Apollo program, all the way from the guys in the rocket to the people on the factory floors, in the subcontractors all over the country. And they realized that they were working for those people, with those people, and were also the beneficiaries of the work those people were doing. And I think they still carry it with them today.
I think that's an important point and a good point to raise, because it's never just 3. It's the world, right? To
Right.
pull off something like this. I want to talk about pulling it off. I mean, I set the stage in the intro, which you didn't hear, as to what, how this all came about so quickly, and they were going to take 4 months to pull it together. Oh my God! I mean,
Exactly.
You got to be nuts to just to even think about that. But I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you some of the discussions that led to that decision to do it in 4 months. I mean, must have been something interesting to peek into in your research.
Well, indeed. And as much as I enjoyed researching what happened in the factories and in the spacecraft and in the vicinity of the moon, what surprised me was how fascinating it was to do the research about what went on in the offices in NASA when they made the decision to do this. Remember, NASA had become very risk-averse by the summer of 1968. They had lost 3 men in the Apollo 1 fire in January of 1967. They were not about to risk three other men on a mission that was considered too dangerous or premature or just an exercise in hubris. So they were willing to miss that John Kennedy deadline to get men on the moon before the end of the 60s, if it meant making sure that when they did get there, they got there alive. And yet, in the summer of 1968, in August, 16 months before Kennedy's deadline ended, George Low, one of the top administrators of NASA, called Chris Kraft and Bob Gilruth into his office and said, look, our Apollo spacecraft, effectively, he said, the Apollo doesn't work. The Saturn V doesn't work. The LEM is hopeless. We're not even close to being able to perfect the machine that's going to land on the lunar surface. But if we're smart, and if we work fast and we work hard, we can fix the Apollo spacecraft. We can get it flight ready. We can fix the Saturn V. We can get it flight ready. And we can kickstart our program by getting 3 guys into lunar orbit by the end of this year, and the launch window being what launch windows being what they were, and the physics of the Earth and the Moon being what they are. It actually turned out to be Christmas week, which was extraordinary. And Kraft and Gilruth effectively said what every other person who was first presented with that idea said, which was, you cannot do that. It's too risky. It's premature. We've seen what happened. And then they started to talk it through, and they thought, well, maybe we can do that. Maybe we can accelerate here. Maybe we can crack down on quality control here and make sure this gets done. And bit by bit, they called people in and invited them to be part of the discussion. They called in a guy named Bob Ernle, who was the head of the computer systems in Houston, and said, can you get the programs ready by December? And he said, if you give me every computer in Buildings 12 and Building 30 at Mission Control and give me the entire weekend, I can tell you if it's possible. And he came back on Monday and said, yes, it's possible. They then flew out to Huntsville, Alabama, and buttonholed Werner von Braun and said, effectively, Werner, your Saturn V doesn't work. Can you fix it by December? And von Braun said, as long as I can get them off the ground and into space, at that point where you point them is fine. It doesn't matter. He said, yes, I can fix it. One piece at a time, the great levers of the moon machine came together. And the last important piece was the astronauts themselves. And that was up to Deke Slayton, who was one of the original 7 astronauts who knew his pilots in some ways better than they knew themselves. And he decided that the crew that was supposed to fly Apollo 9, which was Borman, Lovell, and Anders, should be bumped up, they should take 8, and they should fly that spacecraft to the moon. And they did it.
Did any of them, and I always think this about success, the minute you question anything, that's the end of it. You have to be forward-thinking, focus on where you're going, and say, nothing is going to stop me. Is that what happened, the mentality? This group, because it's a group, the 3 guys are in front, clearly, but as you said, it's a team effort. Did you get the sense that it was, we're just going to do what we have to do? That's it, and we'll do it.
Absolutely, and that's a really good question. And yes, there was a monomaniacal focus from all of them. The astronauts, remember, this happened in the summer of 1968. 1968, or the planning took place then. 1968 was the most horrible, was the bloodiest year in contemporary human history. There were the assassinations at home, the riots at home, the riot at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Tet Offensive. It was disaster after disaster in a blood-soaked year. And even with all of that, the guys in mission control and the astronauts, when you talk to them now, they say, look, we were patriots. We knew what was going on. We knew what our country was going through. But to us, it was all sort of a dull thumping. It was a flash behind a scrim. We were focused on the work we were doing. It's more than a metaphor that mission control is a windowless room. They could watch on TV what was going on. These guys, a lot of them had friends who were fighting in Vietnam. The astronauts themselves were fighter pilots, and their colleagues and their Naval Academy classmates were fighting in Vietnam. But they all focused on this one huge battle in the Cold War. You know, when I talked to Jim Lovell when we were writing Apollo 13, and I asked him, as so many people have, how he was able to maintain his cool in space, he said, it was like playing solitaire. As long as you have a card to turn over, you're still in the game. Until you are out of cards, you're still in the game.
Oh, so God, that's a great line.
Focus on that.
Yeah, that's a terrific line.
He said it really amused me because one of the reviews, Apollo 13, I'm happy to say the book got generally good reviews, but there was one review that said, well, we don't really learn enough about what's in the astronauts' heads. And Lovell looked at that and kind of laughed, and he said, what was in my head? Trying to go home was in my head. What do they mean? What was I feeling? I was trying to go home. That was it. He was just, I'm doing a job here. Don't bother me with details. It's really quite wonderful, the way they can compartmentalize.
Well, I'm going to decompartmentalize, because what were the odds of them returning successfully? Is that a number that was available?
That was a number that was available, but people crunch those numbers different ways. You know, in some way, it's always binary. You're either going to succeed or you're going to die. So, but that's sort of true of everything. In some ways, it's binary. You go out to work today. You're either going to come home fine or a building's going to fall on you. They obviously had a much harder job than just walking out in the street and hoping a building doesn't fall on you. Jim Lovell, in the center seat, really didn't consider the odds. When I talked to him about it, he said, it was a mission. We either were going to make it or we weren't going to make it. And he just loved flying in space. Jim was never quite so happy as when he was flying in space, and I frankly think he would go back today. Frank Borman, the commander, tried not to think about it also, but his wife, Susan, was determined to find out. And she buttonholed Chris Kraft, who was the director of flight crew operations. Kraft is still around. He's in his 90s also. He still is a wiry, frank, sandpapery, wonderfully profane man. I love talking to Chris Kraft. And she got him aside when he came to their house for a cocktail party once before the mission flew. And she said, Chris, I want you to tell me what the odds are of their making it back. And Chris said, you really mean that, don't you? Because often family members would say they wanted to know the odds, but they really just wanted reassurance. So he said, you really, really want to know that, don't you? And she said, yes, I do, and you know I do. And he said, fine, how's 50-50? And her answer was, I suspected as much. Bill Anders, who crunched the numbers on his own, he was the man in the right-hand seat and was an engineer, and he was pretty good at estimating the reliability of a spacecraft. He put the odds at 33, 33, 33. A one-third chance they would make it to the moon, they would get home, they would completely succeed. A one-third chance that they were going to come home alive, but they would not successfully make it to the moon. And a one-third chance they were going to die in the effort. And in anticipation of that, he made 2 audio recordings before he left the house to go to the moon. One was to be played for his 5 children. He had 5 small kids. For his 5 children on Christmas Eve, assuming everything was going well. And then one was to be played, as I say in the book, if there were no Christmas Eves to come.
Fascinating people made of some kind of character that a lot of us probably wouldn't have. And I wonder if you found something in each of them that they each got as kids that fortified them to be the steely yet warm characters that they and brilliant characters they became as adult human beings.
That's a really wonderful question. The two stories, I will admit that I know Frank's and Jim's, Borman's and Lovell's stories a little better than I know Anders, and I know them as individuals a little bit better. I think certainly all of them had stable, loving parents. In the case of Jim, grew up, his father died when Jim was relatively young in a car accident. He had a very supportive mother, however, so they all grew up with stable backgrounds. But in the case especially of Borman and Lovell, whether it was their circumstances that gave them their temperament or their temperament that built their circumstances, I think it's impossible to know. I know in both cases, both were incredibly tenacious people. Both of them applied to military academies. Borman went to West Point. Lovell went to Annapolis. Both of them got only a third alternate slot. In the case of Borman, amazingly, the long shot came through, and three other guys who had been accepted ahead of him passed on the chance, and he was in. In the case of Lovell's chance, the long shot didn't come through, and he instead entered a program called the Holloway program that would allow him to become a naval aviator and to enter the Navy as an officer, but it wasn't quite the same as going to Annapolis. And then later, a belated acceptance to Annapolis came through 2 years later, and he said, you know what, it's worth it to me to start my education all over if I'm going to be an Annapolis man. So both of them had a very sharply focused sense of what they wanted. Borman was grounded for a year before he ever got to fight in Korea, which is what he wanted to do, because of a burst eardrum while he was flying. He had to fight to return to flight status. Both of these guys just fought and fought and fought to get where they were going because they had exactly that kind of unflinching focus that we were describing earlier, and I think that worked for them.
And character counts. In the interest of time, December 21st, 68 launch date, the flight's fraught with danger, filled with heart and soul and intrigue. Talk to me about the Soviets. So those Russians, they're back in the news. You reveal details of secret It's true, darling, right? It's like everything old is new again. You reveal great secrets and great details in this book about conversations inside the Soviet Central Research Building outside of Moscow as the mission was unfolding and the Apollo 8 broadcasts were beaming down from space, and I was alive, young, baby, just a child, but I remember it well. And I can only tell you, you think about those crackly, when we heard them coming in on those old radio that they used up there. I mean, oh my God, to go back. But talk to me about background stuff like that. I love the intrigue.
Well, and there actually is. There are records now that Soviet scientists finally wrote, and he compiled them into a 4-volume set of his recollections of what happened there. And it was pretty extraordinary. They had to, even in the Central Research Building, they had to pirate the signals from Eurovision because signals from the West could not make it through. Soviet scrambling. They didn't want the people in the country to see what was going on in the West, and they couldn't see it in the research building either. Well, they were able to pirate a signal. It wasn't a great signal, and they were able to watch what was going on. The first thing they saw was the launch, and these guys were missile men. So on the one hand, they were in a foot race with the Americans. On the other hand, they all honored the missile man's credo, which is you never want anything to go wrong with another man's rocket, with another country's rocket. And yet when the Saturn V took off, and the first stage burned out and separated. If you've ever watched that footage, it actually looks like the rocket is exploding. There's a huge flare that consumes it, and then the flare dies, and you see the first stage fall away, and the second stage lights, and off the rocket goes. And the Soviet writer admitted that they all caught their breath and looked at one another with a guilty sense of, oh, good, we're still in this fight. And they all felt shame over that. And then the second stage lit, and they knew two things. They knew these guys didn't lose their rocket, these guys didn't die, but we have just lost this race. At the end of that first session, they were asked by the head of what was then what was known as Roscosmos, the Russian NASA, come back Monday and tell me what we can do to catch the Americans now. Tell me what's possible. And they came back Monday and they said nothing. Nothing is possible.
I love it.
And they knew at that point that they had lost this race.
Yeah, pretty fascinating when you think about it, particularly as where we are today. Apollo 8 took 3 days to travel to the moon. It orbited 10 times over the course of 20 hours, during which the crew made a Christmas Eve television broadcast. Mr. Kluger, this is extraordinary to me. At that time, it was the most watched TV program ever. And what did they do? They broadcast the first 10 verses they read the first 10 books from the book of Genesis. Whose idea was that? What was that all? That was brilliant PR.
It was extraordinary PR, and it was the idea of a guy named Ron Layton, who had worked for the American Information Bureau or American Information Services, which, I mean, it's a government agency, and its job does essentially what it says: sell the American story to the world. And he did not know what in the world to give them to say. It was a guy, the head of public affairs, first came to Frank Borman before they ever left and said, hey, listen, you're going to have the largest audience in the world that has ever witnessed anything. We're estimating 1 billion people, which was 1 out of 3 people on the entire planet at the time. Figure out what you want to say. And Frank Borman said, well, what should I say? And he said, just do something appropriate. Well, that wasn't very helpful. So Ron Layton was assigned the job of doing this. And the story goes, and it has actually been confirmed, that he was staying up late. He stayed up late many nights, and he was in his kitchen late, 3 or 4 in the morning, with his manual typewriter in front of him, trying to write things for them to say. And his wife walked in the kitchen and said, I have it, Genesis. And he essentially said, yes, you do have it. That's exactly right. So they typed that up on fireproof paper, because after the Apollo 1 fire, nothing went into the spacecraft that was flammable. It was put in the back of the flight plan. For the first part of that broadcast, the astronauts gave a little travelogue impromptu of what they were seeing out of their window. And then they read Genesis. And they ended with Frank Borman saying, and from the crew of Apollo 8, we wish you good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. Now, look, you could be a person of faith, you could be an atheist. If your heart didn't burst at that, you had no heart. I was a cynical adolescent watching that. Even I, who swore I would never shed tears because I was an adolescent boy, I missed it up at that. How could you not be moved by that?
Absolutely. Brilliant, and heartfelt. When they were on the far side of the moon, which sounds like a comic strip, they were out of radio contact with Earth. Share with us some of the details of the private conversations that they had. Just give me about a minute or 30 seconds of that, because I have a couple more questions and I'm watching that clock.
Sure. The thing that struck me the most was when they fired their engine to settle into lunar orbit, because in order to do that, they had to slow down. Well, when you're near another world, you don't want to slow down. If you slow down, you're going to get grabbed by gravity and you're going to crash into the surface. So they had to slow down just enough to be captured by gravity so that they could still orbit. They pointed the spacecraft backwards. They fired that engine. They knew that the engine was going to be 4.5 minutes. It was going to have to burn for 4.5 minutes, which is an awfully long time. And you hear them in the recordings. You hear them buckling into their seats. They light the engine. After a minute, one of them says, geez, just 1 minute so far? And then another minute unfolds, and you hear one of them say, this is the longest 4 minutes I have ever spent in my life. They count off until they get to 0, and then Lovell shuts the engine off, looks at the instrument panel, and he calls out 2 numbers, 160 by 169, and they whooped, because that meant they were in an elliptical orbit, 160 miles by 69 miles. It was exactly what NASA had told them they would get. It was exactly what the flight plan called for. They were the only people in all of humanity who knew they had succeeded. The rest of the world would not know until they had come back around the front again.
Fascinating. Borman got sick, right? He really suffered from space sickness.
Yes, before nearly all other American flights had been in the Mercury or Gemini spacecraft, and they were tiny. They were so small the astronauts could never get out of their seats. Well, if you can't get out of your seat, you don't really experience motion sickness. The Apollo spacecraft was much larger, so they could float out and move around. And the second they all got out of their seats, they realized this is a very different experience. Lovell experienced a little bit of time. His stomach sort of turned over. Anders did as well. But Borman got severely space sick for the first 12 hours they were in space, and there was a real risk they were going to have to abort the mission. Not so much because Borman couldn't have toughed it out. He was and remains a very gritty guy. He would have done what he had to do. But because nobody knew why they were sick. Nobody knew why Borman was suffering the way he was. And there were only two very bad answers that the surgeon could determine. Either he had a virus, which meant that the other two guys were definitely going to catch it because they were in a sealed spacecraft, or he had gotten sick by moving through the Van Allen radiation belts. Nobody had flown through the Van Allen belts before. And while on the one hand, they knew that the radiation you would absorb was little more than what you would get in a dental x-ray, on the other hand, given the time it took to get through it, it would be like a 7-hour dental x-ray. Well, that's not a good thing. So they were Dr. Chuck Berry, it was a wonderful name, who was the flight surgeon, was convinced that it was radiation sickness, and he recommended scrubbing the mission. They actually phoned that up to the astronauts and said, Dr. Berry says you should basically abort. And Borman actually laughed at that and refused and said, you're talking to grown-ups here. We can do this. Don't worry about us. And after about 12 hours, he got better.
I love that. I think that's such a great story. Now, I'm going to tease the audience, and I don't want you to answer this, but something did happen on Apollo 8 that you talk about in the book that leads to Jim Lovell, who, by the way, was the man who said, Houston, we've got a problem in Apollo 13, for those of the name sounds familiar, but you're not sure. But that Apollo 8, Jim Lovell might have never survived the disaster of Apollo 13 had he not learned something very important in Apollo 8. But you're not going to tell what that is right now. We're going to tell people, now you got to read this great book, right? Right. I'm a tease. I'm really bad.
Exactly, yes.
I'm a naughty.
Say a thing.
All right. So listen, Jeffrey, no one can doubt that the flight of Apollo 8 was groundbreaking. And there were accomplishments by the, oh my gosh, that's still influenced today. Can you name just a few?
For one thing, the Earthrise photo. That was taken when the crew was on their third orbit of the moon. They were arcing around from the far side. They had yet to see Earth from the moon, and suddenly they saw the blue-white glass sphere of Earth rising up over just the wrecked beach of the moon. Their breath caught. They went to take pictures, and Bill Anders, who was the mission photographer, realized he only had a black and white film magazine in his camera. He barked at Lovell, get me some color film. Lovell darted down to the lower equipment bay, got him color film. They shot off a bunch of pictures, and that picture became what was thought of as the image that animated the environmental program. Had there been no Earthrise picture, there may have been no environmental program, or at least not the way it began, with the energy with which it began. Because for the first time, we were seeing what a rare thing a living world is. For the first time, we were seeing what life in the void of space looks like. And that reminded people that the Earth is destructible. I think the other part of the Apollo 8 legacy was that it allowed for Apollos 9 through 17 to happen. It allowed for the lunar landings, and it also allowed for people to see that we were capable of being a species of two worlds instead of a species of just one world. It allowed us to realize that you can come up with these crazy ideas that in 1961 President Kennedy can say, we're going to get to the moon in 8 years, when we had had exactly 17 minutes of flight experience by then, Alan Shepard's suborbital flight in 1961. And we did it. It was a reminder that when the U.S. or any country chooses to do something extraordinary, they can do something extraordinary. And that, I think, is the enduring legacy of Apollo 8. Kennedy used the words, we choose to go to the moon, and we chose in 1968 to do it.
A good lesson for today, by the way. A good reminder. Wonderful book, Mr. Kluger, and great voice. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate your time, and you ask great questions, and I could chat with you all day if we had the time.
We'll do it again sometime. I just want to hear the voice. Thank you, darling. I've been speaking with Jeffrey Kluger. His new book, Apollo 8, the thrilling story of the first mission to the moon. For more information on Mr. Kluger and his wonderful book, visit time.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of RESEC LLC. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. Visit hallicasserjayne.com.